There's a hierarchy that exists in every art form, an unspoken caste system that separates those who create from those who perform, those who write from those who interpret, those who shape culture from those who merely entertain. In music, this division was particularly pronounced in the late 1960s when songwriters and composers occupied the highest tier of artistic legitimacy, while instrumentalists, no matter how skilled, were often viewed as skilled laborers executing someone else's vision. The Beatles had elevated themselves to the very summit of this hierarchy, not just as performers, but as composers whose songs were being analyzed in universities, whose lyrics were treated as poetry, whose studio innovations were studied as seriously as classical compositions. John Lennon, in particular, positioned himself as an artist in the fullest sense, someone whose work engaged with literature and philosophy and avant-garde art, whose ambitions extended far beyond entertainment into territory he considered genuinely important and culturally significant. When Jimi Hendrix arrived in London in September 1966 and began his rapid ascent to fame, Lennon's initial response to the guitarist was polite acknowledgement tinged with dismissiveness. Here was someone doing extraordinary things with an instrument, certainly. Someone whose visual performance style was getting attention and whose technical abilities were impressive to other guitarists. But to Lennon and to many in the Beatles circle, Jimi represented a different category of musician entirely, a showman. Someone whose artistry was primarily in performance rather than composition, whose innovations were technical rather than conceptual, whose impact was immediate and visceral rather than intellectually engaging or culturally transformative in the way that Lennon believed the Beatles' work to be. This assessment wasn't delivered with malice or contempt, but with the casual certainty of someone whose position at the center of cultural relevance made his judgments feel objective and authoritative. Jimi was talented, yes, but he was fundamentally doing something different from what the Beatles were doing, something that existed in a separate and lower tier of artistic achievement. And when Lennon first used the phrase that would later haunt him, calling Jimi just a showman in conversation with other musicians, it came from this place of categorical thinking, of believing that performance, virtuosity, and compositional genius were distinct and hierarchical categories, and that what Jimi excelled at was impressive, but ultimately less important than what Lennon and the Beatles were accomplishing. Before we step into the moment when that certainty collapsed, when Lennon encountered something in Jimi's playing that didn't fit his categories and left him literally frozen and unable to respond, hit subscribe to this channel, because what follows comes from the musicians who were there, who watched one genius recognize another despite his prejudices, and who witnessed the instant when performance revealed itself to be composition happening in real time, when technical mastery proved inseparable from artistic vision. London, 1967. The Beatles are in the aftermath of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that has redefined what's possible in popular music and elevated the band's status from successful entertainers to serious artists whose work deserves consideration alongside any music being made anywhere in the world. The album's conceptual ambition, its studio innovations, its lyrical depth and musical sophistication have created a cultural moment where the Beatles aren't just making hit records, but are seen as pushing the boundaries of what the medium can express and accomplish. Lennon's contributions to Sgt. Pepper, particularly A Day in the Life, represent his artistic ambitions at their highest point, combining surreal lyrical imagery with revolutionary studio techniques to create something that feels genuinely new and important, something that transcends the limitations of pop music and enters territory that Lennon believes is artistically legitimate in ways that most rock music isn't. Lennon's state of mind in 1967 is complex and contradictory, shaped by LSD experiences that have expanded his consciousness, while also creating confusion about how to integrate those experiences into his art. By his relationship with Yoko Ono, which is pulling him toward avant-garde conceptual work that most Beatles fans don't understand or appreciate. By his awareness that the Beatles are approaching some kind of limit in terms of where they can go as a conventional band. He's simultaneously at the peak of his success and restless about its limitations, celebrated as one of popular music's most important artists while feeling trapped by the expectations and formats of that success. This internal tension makes Lennon particularly invested in maintaining clear distinctions between serious art and mere entertainment. between work that matters culturally and work that just succeeds commercially. When Lennon talks about other musicians in this period, his judgments are sharp and often dismissive, reflecting his need to establish hierarchy and to position the Beatles' work as superior to and different from what others are doing. He respects Bob Dylan as a fellow songwriter whose work operates on similar intellectual and poetic levels, acknowledges certain jazz and classical composers as legitimate artists, but regards most rock musicians, even successful ones, as fundamentally doing something less important than what he's attempting. This isn't insecurity or defensiveness, but the natural psychology of someone who has invested enormous creative energy into work he believes represents genuine artistic achievement and who needs to maintain categorical distinctions to preserve that belief. Jimi Hendrix enters Lennon's awareness in late 1966 through the usual channels of music industry gossip and media coverage, impossible to ignore because Jimi's impact on London's music scene is immediate and dramatic. Lennon hears the stories about how Jimi is transforming what's possible on electric guitar, reads reviews that compare Jimi's stage presence to theatrical performance art, encounters claims that Jimi is revolutionizing rock music in ways comparable to what the Beatles have accomplished. Lennon's response to all this attention is complicated by the fact that Jimi's revolution is happening on his instrument rather than in his songwriting, through performance innovation rather than compositional sophistication, in ways that don't align with Lennon's framework for understanding what makes music important or artistically legitimate. The phrase, "just a showman," that Lennon uses to describe Jimi before they properly meet comes from multiple witnesses who heard Lennon make similar comments in different contexts throughout early 1967. The phrase isn't delivered with the harsh contempt that Miles Davis brought to his rock clown dismissal, but with a kind of polite condescension, an acknowledgement that Jimi is very good at what he does, combined with an implicit suggestion that what he does isn't quite on the same level as serious composition and conceptual artistry. Lennon comparing Jimi's guitar theatrics to showmanship, to performance art that's impressive to watch but doesn't engage with the deeper questions about music's purpose and potential that Lennon believes the Beatles are exploring. The distinction Lennon is making reflects broader assumptions about how artistic value gets assigned and measured. Assumptions that privilege composition over performance, songs over instrumental music, the creator of material over the interpreter of it. These assumptions run deep in Western musical culture, particularly in the late 1960s when rock music is trying to establish itself as artistically legitimate by aligning with compositional traditions rather than with performance traditions that might be associated with entertainment and spectacle. For Lennon, who is deeply invested in having his work taken seriously as art rather than dismissed as pop entertainment, maintaining this hierarchy is important, and Jimi's success threatens to blur categories that Lennon wants to keep distinct. Several of the Beatles have already encountered Jimi by early 1967. Paul McCartney was in the audience at the Bag O' Nails when Jimi played Sgt. Pepper just days after the album's release, an experience that apparently impressed McCartney with both Jimi's musicianship and his respect for the Beatles' work. George Harrison has jammed with Jimi at various London clubs and speaks about him with genuine admiration, recognizing in Jimi's approach to guitar something that goes beyond technical facility into genuinely creative territory. But Lennon hasn't sought out these encounters, hasn't made the effort to see Jimi perform, or to engage with his music beyond hearing it casually, in contexts where he's not really listening with full attention. The encounter that changes everything happens through circumstances that multiple witnesses remember, but with variations in specific details. The core facts are consistent across accounts. Lennon and Jimi meet at a jam session in a London club, likely the Bag O' Nails or the Speakeasy, sometime in late 1967 or early 1968. These clubs were regular gathering places for musicians where informal playing sessions would develop, where hierarchies were temporarily suspended, and people would just play together without the formal structures of rehearsed performances. Lennon is there with other Beatles circle musicians. Jimi arrives either alone or with members of the Experience, and someone suggests they jam together, either genuinely hoping for musical magic or possibly trying to engineer a meeting between two of London's most important musical figures. Lennon approaches the jam with what witnesses describe as polite but reserved energy, the body language of someone participating in a social ritual rather than expecting anything musically significant to happen. He's done countless jam sessions with countless guitarists, most of whom play competently but don't surprise him or challenge his understanding of what the instrument can do. He has no particular reason to expect that this session with Jimi will be different, no sense that what's about to happen will force him to reconsider assumptions he's held about the relationship between performance and composition, between technical virtuosity and artistic vision. They start playing something simple, probably a blues progression or a rock standard that everyone knows, the kind of common ground that allows musicians from different contexts to find each other musically without extensive discussion or arrangement. Lennon is playing rhythm guitar or possibly piano, providing chord changes and watching as Jimi begins to explore the musical space they've created. And what happens next, according to the multiple musicians present, is that Jimi doesn't just play the song or demonstrate his technical facility, but begins to compose in real time, developing melodic ideas that respond to and extend what Lennon and the other musicians are doing, creating variations that show genuine compositional thinking happening spontaneously, building structures that have internal logic and developmental coherence. What Lennon hears is something that doesn't fit his category of showmanship or performance virtuosity. Jimi is improvising, yes, but he's improvising with the kind of thematic development and harmonic sophistication that Lennon associates with serious composition. Jimi is creating melodies that would work as song hooks, chord progressions that sound composed rather than randomly generated, musical phrases that have the kind of memorable quality that Lennon spends hours in the studio trying to achieve. And he's doing all of this spontaneously, without apparent effort, as if the boundary between conception and execution doesn't exist for him, as if the composing and the performing are the same action rather than separate processes. The witnesses present describe Lennon's playing gradually stopping, his attention shifting from participant to observer, his focus becoming completely absorbed in analyzing what Jimi is doing and how it relates to musical principles that Lennon has spent his entire career developing. Lennon, who is rarely at a loss for words, who always has opinions and expresses them immediately, goes completely silent except for the music, his face showing the concentration of someone encountering something that challenges fundamental assumptions. What makes this moment particularly significant is what it reveals about the inadequacy of the categories Lennon has been using to organize his musical understanding. The distinction between showman and artist, between performer and composer, between technical display and genuine creativity, all of these neat divisions that allowed Lennon to position himself and the Beatles at the top of some hierarchy collapse when confronted with what Jimi is actually doing. Because Jimi is demonstrating that performance can be composition, that technical virtuosity can be inseparable from artistic vision, that someone working primarily through their instrument rather than through songs can be engaging with exactly the same creative challenges and achieving results that are just as artistically significant as anything being created in recording studios with unlimited time and resources. Jimi plays for what people estimated as 15 to 20 minutes, developing ideas, responding to the other musicians, creating moments of remarkable beauty and complexity, showing range that goes from delicate melodic playing to explosive energy, demonstrating control and intention behind everything he's doing, rather than just playing impressive licks or showing off his technical abilities. And when the music finally winds down and stops, when the room goes quiet and everyone looks to Lennon for his response, expecting him to offer some comment or judgment, or at least acknowledgement of what just happened, Lennon remains completely frozen. Multiple musicians who were present described this moment in similar terms. Lennon sitting or standing motionless, his expression somewhere between stunned and thoughtful, his body language showing someone who has just experienced something that requires processing before any response is possible. The silence extends long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough that people start to wonder if Lennon is upset or angry or simply doesn't know what to say. One witness later said it felt like watching someone's entire framework for understanding music get dismantled in 20 minutes, watching someone who had been certain about hierarchies and categories suddenly realize that those certainties were prejudices rather than truths. When Lennon finally speaks, his first words aren't a judgment or evaluation, but a question directed at Jimi. He wants to know how Jimi developed the musical ideas he was playing, whether he composes his solos in advance or creates them spontaneously, how he thinks about harmonic relationships and melodic development, whether he's consciously applying musical theory or working purely intuitively. The questions reveal that Lennon is no longer thinking of Jimi as just a showman, but is recognizing him as someone engaged in the same creative process that Lennon himself uses, someone whose musical thinking is sophisticated and intentional rather than just instinctive or showy. Jimi's responses to Lennon's questions are characteristically modest and somewhat evasive, not because he's hiding anything, but because he genuinely doesn't analyze his own process in the intellectual terms that Lennon is using. Jimi talks about hearing melodies in his head and trying to find them on the guitar, about chord progressions suggesting certain paths that he follows or deliberately avoids, about the emotional quality he's trying to create and letting technical choices serve that emotional purpose. His explanations are less systematic than Lennon's questions, but they reveal someone who is absolutely making compositional choices in real time, who has internalized musical principles so thoroughly that he can deploy them spontaneously without conscious analysis. The conversation that follows the jam session continues for hours, according to witnesses, with Lennon and Jimi talking about music with mutual respect and fascination, neither one positioning himself as superior or treating the other as representative of a lesser category. Lennon asks questions that show genuine interest in understanding Jimi's approach and influences. Jimi asks questions about the Beatles' studio techniques and compositional methods that show he's equally interested in learning from Lennon's process. The exchange demonstrates what becomes possible when genre prejudices and hierarchical thinking are suspended, when musicians recognize each other as artists working on parallel challenges rather than competing in some contest where only one approach can be legitimate. The transformation in Lennon's understanding of Jimi happens entirely during that evening, the frozen moment of silence marking the instant when his previous categories collapsed and new understanding began to form. In subsequent conversations with other musicians, Lennon speaks about Jimi with genuine respect and admiration, no longer qualifying his praise with distinctions about showmanship versus serious artistry, no longer suggesting that what Jimi does is impressive but fundamentally different from what the Beatles are accomplishing. Lennon recognizes that Jimi is solving the same creative problems that Lennon faces, finding ways to express musical ideas that are original and meaningful, using his instrument as a compositional tool rather than just as a performance vehicle. The respect becomes mutual and documented. Jimi speaks about Lennon and the Beatles in interviews with reverence, calling them major influences, saying that Sgt. Pepper showed him possibilities for what rock music could be, that songs like A Day in the Life demonstrated ambition and vision that inspired him to think bigger about his own work. The acknowledgement from Lennon apparently meant something significant to Jimi, validation from someone whose artistic legitimacy was universally recognized, confirmation that what Jimi was doing through performance and instrumental innovation was being recognized as genuine artistic achievement rather than just entertainment or technical display. They discussed the possibility of collaborating, of creating music together that would combine the Beatles' compositional sophistication with Jimi's improvisational approach, the structure and concept that Lennon brings with the spontaneous creativity that Jimi generates. These discussions apparently reached the point of making tentative plans, talking about studios and scheduling, imagining what could result from bringing their different strengths together. But practical obstacles keep interfering. The Beatles are working on the White Album and dealing with internal tensions that make outside collaborations difficult. Jimi is touring constantly and working on his own increasingly ambitious studio projects, and the collaboration keeps getting postponed until eventually circumstances make it impossible. When Jimi dies in September 1970, Lennon's response is documented in interviews and reported by people close to him. Lennon describes feeling that something important had been lost, that Jimi's death represented not just the loss of a talented musician, but the end of possibilities for where rock music could go if its greatest instrumentalist and one of its best composers had collaborated. Lennon mentions the jam session when he first really heard what Jimi could do, describes it as one of the experiences that changed his understanding of what music could be and where genuine creativity could come from. The musicians who witnessed the jam session and saw Lennon's frozen response later spoke about it as an important moment in music history, evidence of how prejudices and categorical thinking can blind even the most talented and intelligent artists to work happening outside their preferred frameworks. They describe watching Lennon's certainty about hierarchies crumble as he encountered something that his categories couldn't contain or explain, watching someone who valued intellectual sophistication and conceptual ambition recognize those qualities in someone he'd dismissed as merely a showman. The story circulated through the music world, partly because it involved two of rock's most important figures. but also because it illustrated something larger about how artistic value gets assigned and recognized. The fact that Lennon's initial dismissal of Jimi as just a showman gave way to frozen silence and then to genuine respect demonstrated that even the most accomplished artists can be wrong about work they haven't seriously engaged with. That categorical distinctions between types of music or approaches to creativity often obscure rather than illuminate what's actually happening artistically. Music critics and historians have used the encounter as an example of the inadequacy of hierarchies that privilege composition over performance, songs over instrumental music, studio craft over live improvisation. The story demonstrates that these distinctions, while they might seem natural and objective, are actually cultural constructions that can prevent recognition of genius that operates outside established categories. Jimi's performance at the jam session wasn't just impressive playing, but was composition happening in real time, creation and execution unified in a way that challenged Lennon's assumption that they were separate processes requiring different skills and representing different levels of artistic achievement. The frozen silence that overtook Lennon after Jimi finished playing represented something more profound than just being impressed by someone's abilities. It was the moment of cognitive dissonance when your framework for understanding something proves inadequate to what you're experiencing. When you have to choose between forcing what you've witnessed to fit your existing categories or allowing your categories to expand and change to accommodate new understanding. Lennon's silence showed him choosing the latter, taking the time necessary to process what he'd heard, rather than immediately asserting judgment based on assumptions that no longer applied. What makes Lennon's response particularly significant is that it came from someone whose own artistic legitimacy was secure and widely recognized, who had no reason to feel threatened by Jimi's abilities or success, who could have maintained his categorical distinctions and dismissive stance without any consequence to his own status or career. The fact that Lennon allowed himself to be genuinely surprised and changed by what he heard from Jimi, that he publicly acknowledged his changed understanding rather than quietly abandoning his previous position, demonstrated intellectual honesty and artistic humility that his musicians and peers respected as much as his creative achievements. The influence of that evening's encounter echoes through both artists' subsequent work in ways that are difficult to measure precisely, but are suggested by various evidence. Lennon's late-period Beatles work and his solo albums show increasing interest in raw improvisational energy and in allowing performance spontaneity to shape final recordings rather than controlling everything through extensive studio overdubs and arrangement. While attributing this specifically to Jimi's influence would be an overstatement, Lennon himself spoke about how seeing Jimi perform changed his understanding of what was possible when technical mastery and creative vision were unified in a single performer. For Jimi, the recognition from Lennon apparently provided validation that his ambitions to create music with lasting artistic importance rather than just immediate impact were legitimate and achievable. Jimi's studio work in his final years shows increasing compositional ambition, songs with more complex structures and arrangements, music that clearly aims for something beyond what could be achieved in live performance, suggesting someone who understood that performance genius and compositional sophistication could coexist and reinforce rather than oppose each other. The jam session where Lennon froze in recognition of Jimi's genius has become part of rock mythology, a story that gets told to illustrate how prejudices can be overcome, how categorical thinking can be transcended, how even the most accomplished artists can learn from those working in different ways or from different starting points. The story's power comes from the specificity of Lennon's frozen response, the detail that shows someone genuinely struggling to reconcile what he's experiencing with what he believed possible, taking the time necessary to process and understand rather than forcing immediate judgment. When you listen to Jimi Hendrix's music knowing that John Lennon, one of rock's most important composers and most intellectually ambitious artists, recognized in Jimi's playing the same compositional sophistication and creative vision that he valued in his own work, it becomes impossible to maintain simplistic distinctions between types of musicians or approaches to creativity. The music exists as evidence that performance can be composition, that technical virtuosity can serve artistic vision, that someone working primarily through instrumental improvisation can be engaging with exactly the same creative challenges and achieving results just as important as someone working through songs and studio craft. Lennon died in 1980, a decade after Jimi, having never created the collaboration they'd discussed. but having acknowledged publicly and privately the impact that encountering Jimi's genius had on his own understanding of music's possibilities. The frozen moment when Lennon first truly heard what Jimi could do, when his prejudices collapsed and his categories proved inadequate, represents one of rock's most significant instances of recognition across supposed boundaries, of one type of genius acknowledging another despite initial misunderstanding, of an artist having the courage and honesty to admit he'd been wrong and to learn from someone he'd dismissed as just a showman doing tricks. The silence wasn't emptiness, but the sound of understanding being rebuilt from foundations up, of someone whose framework for evaluating music had proven insufficient, taking the time necessary to construct something more adequate to what he'd experienced. That Lennon allowed himself that silence, resisted the impulse to immediately assert judgment or maintain his previous position, showed more artistic maturity and intellectual honesty than maintaining certainty would have demonstrated. Real confidence includes the capacity to be surprised, to recognize your own limitations, to learn from those working in ways you initially failed to understand or value.